the arguments against fighting for marriage that I was getting from, friends and colleagues within the community, and we're not even talking about the larger public discussions, really had two different iterations. There were the people who believed that marriage was a bad goal. This was a flawed institution, a failed institution, a patriarchal institution, an oppressive institution, particularly for women. But in any case, failing and dying, people were getting divorced, people were quitting, people were cheating, people were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So why would we want to fight for this? Why would we want to have this, and so on? Then there was the other ideological overlay that overlapped but was not identical, which were the people who believed that as gay people, we should be outlaws. We should be free. We shouldn't be fighting to join. We should be fighting to redefine. Why should we assimilate? We should liberate, etc. And as I said, these views were disproportionately represented amongst those of us who had come into the activist front lines. And the debates and arguments were very, very intense, often quite personal, difficult. It was by far the hardest part for me of that period of the 80s, not the actual battling, the actual enemies and opponents who were out there in legion and ascendant at that moment, in addition to AIDS and the fear of dying and our friends dying and the loss we experienced. But what was always most difficult was this infighting and this internal division. And marriage was really the number one thing, I would say, that we as activists in that band fought over during that very intense period. But we also fought very strongly together against the oppression and discrimination and death and disease that we were dealing with at the very same time. So it was a very fraught, in part exhilarating, challenging period that is hard for, I think, a lot of people to imagine who were not part of it, even though, people like you and I actually lived through it.
I find it the hardest thing to get people to understand. They think that someone came up with gay marriage, everyone in the gay community supported it, and then over 30 years we all got it. And that's just simply not true. Right. It was a much more interesting, complex situation, which I think is worth unspooling here. Sure. So essentially, the broader world, I think, looked at this idea and thought it was ridiculous. I mean, I'm not kidding. I remember the first show I went on, CNN on Crossfire, I think it was probably 1989, 1990. I can't remember exactly when it was. And I was literally laughed at. This is the most ridiculous idea I've ever heard come. It was Gary Bauer and Patrick Buchanan.
Yeah.
Two good friends. But it was actually Buchanan's a nice. Well, that's another story. But he's one of these strange fascists who's actually a really nice person. But there you go. Life is complicated. But within the gay community, there was this, within the activist community rather, there was this very, very suspicious and sometimes angry response to it. How did you deal with the personal sense of being, opposed by your friends, by the people you thought you were fighting with? That can't have been that easy.
It wasn't. I mean, that was, as I said, that was really the hardest part personally, in the same way that your family can push your buttons like no one else. Arguments with friends are the most painful. This was the most difficult, the most painful part of being a young activist and being on the front lines, et cetera. But at the same time, and this is just the luck of my own temperament, as well as I think a useful instrumental approach to success in life, I really tried to stay on the high road. I tried not to take things as personally. I tried to not slam doors. And I also didn't wait for permission all the time either. I wasn't trying to get everyone to agree. One of my philosophies of activism is you don't need you need enough. So you don't have to bang your head on the wall. You can go find a doorway somewhere else and, leave it for a time and come back to it. And I think I'd had good training in that with my family and friends over the years. We're all very talkative, very willing to express, very engaged, very connected. And of course, that also meant we could push each other's buttons and didn't agree. And I chose and learned and got better, I'd like to think, as I got along, at not letting it be preclusive, not letting
The other strategy I saw in you from the beginning was that anyone who wanted to support us, doesn't matter where they're from, we want. Yeah. In other words, you were seeking converts, not pursuing heretics from the get-go. And so when someone like me showed up in 89 with this story the conservative case for gay marriage, in which I'm coming from a completely different political tradition, although obviously we were also going through the same scholarship and the same understanding of what homosexuality was and Boswell's influence and all the rest of it. We were the only person to reach out to me and say, well, how can we work together? How can we move this forward? And for others, I was anathema. And that was one of the first times, of course, I felt this man is different than the others. Tell me about that philosophy, because you from the get-go wanted to make sure we didn't alienate anyone we didn't have to alienate, that we would actually make this argument in terms of what we had in common with other people, not in terms of what we wanted to get from other people, as it were.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are several aspects to that. One is that I feel that if somebody who I don't agree with, who may have a whole bunch of views or even actions that I think are terrible or wrong or whatever, agrees with me on this one thing, this is not me agreeing with them. This is them agreeing with me. This is them joining our cause. It doesn't mean I have to support their cause on the 80 million things I may not agree with. So whether it be Republicans or, quote unquote, conservatives, et cetera, here's something we agree on. That's the meaning of coalition. Coalition is people who may not agree on everything, who aren't working on all the same things. They're not duplicates. They're coming together on the thing or things they can agree on. So that there's that aspect. I also believe in evolution. I believe in people can change, and as we engage with each other, we can improve.
But you have to give people space to change.
Yes, exactly.
You have to give them space.
That's right.
And if you instantly condemn them and demonize them, it's much harder for them to come back to you. And that strikes me as a very important strategy in any civil rights movement, to keep other people open to joining and constantly seek converts rather than heretics.